Hypoxia is a physical condition which takes place when the atmosphere does not contain sufficient oxygen to support the normal requirements of our bodies. All animal life on Earth depends on oxygen for existence. The fish extract their life-sustaining oxygen from the water. Birds and land animals, including man, get their supply from the atmosphere. Our atmosphere, the gaseous envelope that surrounds the Earth, is composed of approximately 20% oxygen and 80% nitrogen. Any air sample at any altitude will always have the same ratio of 1 part of oxygen to 4 parts of nitrogen. At sea level, there is an ample supply of oxygen available. But as we go higher and higher above the Earth, the air is thinner, less dense, until at 40,000 feet, a given amount of oxygen occupies nearly 5½ times the space that it would at sea level. Under normal conditions, our bodies obtain the oxygen necessary to sustain life by inhaling air into our lungs. Oxygen molecules, represented by the red dots, are taken up by the blood, while the nitrogen is exhaled back into the atmosphere. In this way, the blood receives a constant supply of oxygen, which it circulates throughout the body. In the brain, as in all body tissue, the oxygen is used to sustain the production of energy, and it is here that the lack of sufficient oxygen is soonest and most vitally felt. As we have seen, atmospheric pressure decreases as altitude increases. Thus, less and less oxygen is pushed into the lungs. As high as 8,000 feet, healthy bodies adapt themselves very well, although exertion of any kind will cause the breathing rate to speed up. But since our oxygen needs are the same regardless of altitude, when we reach, say, 16,000 feet, the lowered oxygen supply begins to affect the body and brain adversely. Headaches, slowing of reflexes, and defective judgment at this altitude are typical reactions to insufficient oxygen, typical symptoms of hypoxia. At 24,000 feet, without cabin pressurization or supplementary oxygen, the average person will lose consciousness in from 4 to 7 minutes. At 25 to 30,000 feet, loss of consciousness is a matter of 1 to 4 minutes. And at 40,000 feet, as little as 20 seconds. To be prepared for any possible emergencies due to loss of cabin pressurization at jet altitudes requires not only supplemental oxygen, but also constant vigilance. Jet mainliner crews are well aware of this, but no one knows it better than the medical director of United Airlines, Dr. George J. Cadera.
Oxygen is necessary to maintain life, but to those of us in the field of aviation and aviation medicine, more important is the fact that an adequate supply of oxygen is necessary to maintain useful consciousness. Now, we've all huffed and puffed when we've hurriedly climbed a flight of stairs or ran to catch a bus. Now, this may lead us to believe that we can tell when we need more oxygen, but we can't tell. There's a vast difference between getting enough air into your lungs and having an adequate supply of oxygen in the air that we breathe. Hypoxia is a very sneaky situation. It's extremely tricky in that the hypoxic individual is unable to self-evaluate his own symptoms. Here with me today is Dr. Murphy, one of my colleagues, and 5 United Airlines aircrew members. They have learned from an experience, which we hope very shortly to share with you, that how to solve the problems of hypoxia should it occur in an unwanted decompression at 30,000 feet. These are our stewardesses, Pat Parnell and Marla Wagner, Captain Bud Gurney, First Officer Dave Bishop, Second Officer Bob Burson, and Dr. Ed Murphy.
With Dr. Murphy as observer, this typical UAL flight crew volunteered to go out to Lockheed Aircraft Corporation in Burbank for a revealing demonstration in their high-altitude test chamber. Lockheed's Dr. William Collier and high-altitude technician Tom Cook supervised the demonstrations. The idea was to see how each of our crew members would react under conditions simulating unwanted decompression in flight, which would expose them to hypoxia. The high-altitude chamber consists of two sections. The cabin section will be pressurized at 10,000 feet. The other section will have sufficient air evacuated so that when the seal between the two sections is broken, the pressure will average out to duplicate ambient air conditions at 30,000 feet. Tom Cook is in charge of this demonstration. Bob will be the only one without an extra supply of oxygen when cabin pressure is changed from 10,000 feet to the reduced pressure at 30,000 feet. Bob is given his final instructions. Rhythmic breathing is begun a few seconds prior to decompression. Cabin pressure will be reduced to 30,000 feet in 12 seconds. Condensation fog is typical in decompression, but in the chamber, special pumps clear it away so that we can see what is going on. The task in this demonstration is a familiar child's game, but now it's anything but a game. The object is to see how long Bob can maintain muscular coordination before he needs supplementary oxygen. And it won't be very long. The first symptoms of hypoxia will be a slight twitching of the lips, then uncertainty of movement and trembling of the hands. Without a normal supply of oxygen, Bob will pass the limits of useful consciousness, all the time thinking that he is functioning normally. That serene feeling that everything is normal or better than normal is also typical of hypoxia. Even with Bud Gurney's coaxing, Bob has no control of his actions. The mask goes on well before unconsciousness sets in. Watch the recovery as oxygen enters the bloodstream and reaches the brain. Gradually, he regains complete coordination. Marla Wagner is the star of the second demonstration. The rhythmic breathing begins, then decompression. The typical fog, always present with decompression, is again cleared away by the special pumps of the high-altitude chamber. When cabin pressure reaches a thin 30,000 feet, Marla starts her task. Each task for every demonstration was selected on the basis of simplicity and designed so that no complicated action would be involved. The length of time before hypoxia symptoms set in varies with each individual. It so happened that Marla proved to have a greater resistance than any of the others. The typical symptoms, trembling of the hands and diminishing muscular coordination, become evident as Marla's brain, without sufficient oxygen, can no longer control her movements. Recovery time will vary with the individual, but during the recovery, the reaction is always the same. The task is resumed without conscious knowledge that there has been any break or interruption in the action. Parnell's demonstration is monitored by Dr. Collier. Her task is to use her eyebrow pencil and lipstick in the usual feminine manner. Decompression, fogging, clearing. And Pat begins her familiar task. As she continues with her task, watch closely and see if you can spot the typical symptoms as they occur. Twitching lips and diminishing muscular control as trembling of the hand sets in. Pat has now lost useful consciousness. After a few breaths of oxygen, she picks up again right where she left off.
Pat's reaction to what she did and how she did it is genuine and spontaneous. Also typical is the self-conscious laughter of an individual who has lost control of herself without realizing it. All three of the subjects were unable to perform the tasks they were given when deprived of sufficient oxygen. Those on oxygen, Bud Gurney and the technicians, had no problem whatsoever. Some of the comments made by the subjects, I believe, are quite significant, and I'd like to read them to you. Pat said, "I had no idea that I wasn't performing right up to par." Marla was even more positive and said, "As far as I knew, I was just doing great." To those of us who know what hypoxia can do, Bob Burson's remarks tell a very basic story. "I was completely unaware that I was slowly but surely losing consciousness. I actually thought that the longer I kept at it, the better I was doing. Even though I was helpless, I thought my coordination was perfect." Each of the subjects lost their ability of self-evaluation and self-criticism in a relatively short period of time when exposed to 30,000 feet without oxygen. Now, this alone should give us ample warning of just how tricky this thing called hypoxia really is. But Captain Bud Gurney and First Officer Dave Bishop volunteered to demonstrate that hypoxia isn't just tricky, it can be deadly.
Going up from 30 to 35,000 feet, it is easy to be trapped into forgetting how critical an added 5,000 feet can be in the event of a sudden decompression. At 35,000 feet, hypoxia really hits you.
It's quick and sudden, and you never know what hits you.
That's right, Dave. And if there are any skeptics about what hypoxia can do, watch closely.
High-altitude technician George Hamp checks all the details of the chamber run with Dave Bishop. Cabin pressure will be at 8,000 feet. Decompression will reduce pressure to 35,000 feet. Dave's task is to turn the pointer of a 360-degree circular scale to the same numbers which are indicated on the handheld cards. It should be easy enough. Cabin pressure is set to the prescribed 8,000-foot altitude. Cabin pressure is reduced to 35,000. Dave starts his task. In seconds, hypoxic symptoms set in, and Dave loses useful consciousness. Loses it while thinking he is perfectly normal. When supplemental oxygen reaches the brain, Dave can resume his task. But there is a residual reaction, and it takes him a noticeable amount of time to perceive an error and correct it. Captain Bud Gurney's task involves the same dial and matching of numbers. But this time, Tom Cook is going to see if Bud, by concentrating, can put on his own mask from the ready position after a deliberate delay. Cabin pressure is set at 8,000. Watch how rapidly those now familiar symptoms of hypoxia will be setting in. There he goes. Tom tells him to put on his mask. Put it on. Put it on. He can't do it, even though his life depends on supplemental oxygen. Another 20 seconds without supplemental oxygen, and Bud would have been dead. There must never be a delay in getting the oxygen mask on. Recovery is normal and uneventful as the life-giving oxygen enters the bloodstream. Slowly but surely, Bud regains full consciousness, but it takes quite a while before normal coordination returns.
Both Gurney and Bishop were unconscious in about 30 seconds. Dave, when did you first realize that you were in trouble?
I never did. In fact, I don't know when my mask was put on.
Well, you're familiar with some of the signs and symptoms of hypoxia. Did you feel any?
At one time, my vision seemed to be blurring, and then it seemed to clear up again. Apparently, however, the time I thought it was clearing, I actually couldn't see anything.
You don't have time to analyze and say to yourself, these are the symptoms of hypoxia. I am about to become unconscious. It doesn't happen that way.
Captain, did you hear the repeated commands to put your oxygen mask on?
No, I didn't. But knowing something of hypoxia, I didn't expect to. That is why, as a captain, I insist that my crew follow the prescribed oxygen discipline.
What it adds up to is this. These demonstrations tell a very definite and complete story. Under the effects of hypoxia, the inability to perform tasks is accompanied by a complete lack of concern for failure and a feeling that everything is going extremely well. whether the decompression is relatively slow or rapid, no one can self-evaluate or analyze his symptoms. This very definitely establishes the fact that the oxygen mask must be readily available or in the ready position at the lower jet altitudes and worn on the face at the higher jet altitudes. In the event of a decompression, and if you do not have your oxygen mask on your face, put it on. If you wait to feel the symptoms of hypoxia before you put your oxygen mask on, you never will.
The solution to hypoxia lies in each crew member accepting the basic responsibility for good oxygen discipline at the altitudes at which our jet aircraft fly.